And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. It's great to have everyone here. It's already a huge crowd. And you're here for part 20 of our X series on the X Steganography factor that we've been discovering over the course of these 20 some odd weeks. And of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia's been doing some great stuff this week, and she'll be taking care of all your questions as well tonight. And of course, when you ask her questions, which we're going to do in the second half of the show, you can ask them in all caps. And in the first part, we're going to explore something we haven't really touched on in the X series, which is the Rockefellers' role in the X-Technology. Now, the Rockefellers have a very significant part to play in this story, and they interface with just about every aspect of what we've been researching. So, whenever we say Rockefeller, there's a number of knee-jerk reactions about what that family has done in terms of monopolizing everything from finance to communications to the medical field to charity foundations. But now we're going to find them in a very interesting area tonight, which is very close to the X technology and the UFO file. One of the things that I want to make mention of here is that this is a two-part episode. So tomorrow night at 6 p.m., we're doing sort of the mystery school side of this. Tonight, we're doing the Rockefellers with the X-Tech and the X-Invisible technology. And it really is a pickup from the last episode on the Secret Space Force, because in that episode, we went in depth into this issue of President Trump and his mention of these invisible planes and how this invisible technology plays into all this and is a major part of the apotheum effect, which is something that a term I use for the effect that comes around this UFO file. So when people who encounter these things start to talk about, time missing or power going out, whatever it happens to be, this apotheum effect, reality distorter, is a major piece of it. And invisibility, as it turns out, when you go into those files and you look at it, comes up a lot more than people realize. And I'm actually surprised that the invisible aspect hasn't been covered more. It has come up, however, in research around the Philadelphia experiment. So you're going to see that these things kind of intersperse with each other and collate into a larger picture, the more we don't see them as separate fragments and just think of them all as a piece of the same kind of untitled chapter. One of the things that we're going to do tonight is go deeply into Nelson Rockefeller. Now, everyone focuses on David, and there's good reason for that. He was the main kind of robber baron of his time, and he certainly had the most impact, and he just died fairly recently. And when he died, I had a conversation with Catherine Austin Fitz about him, and a few things have been going on in my mind in relation to that conversation and a conversation that I had with Nomi Prinz in an interview that I did with her maybe a couple of years ago now. But she did a lot of in-depth work to figure out the relationship and the antagonisms between the Kennedys and the Rockefellers, and they ran deep. And we're going to get into those tonight and understand how the Dulles brothers and the Rockefellers are basically one piece of the same picture, and they were in direct opposition to the things that the Kennedys were trying to do. What we're going to do is bring all that together, and what I wanted to say is that the artists in the audience tonight are going to come in so handy, because the only way, and I mean the only way, that I've found to get into the X steganography with the Rockefellers is through their art collection, because they're very careful about how they identify with that UFO file and the X technology. They do not leave a lot of easy public triggers to pick up on, and those links really need to be sought out. However, when we go, and we're going to dive right into the art aspects to start things off, because the art collection that Nelson Rockefeller had is an incredible autobiographical journey on his part. And one of the things that I started to notice in relation to his death, his life, the way that he's identified, is always his massive art collection. And it's quite interesting, the role that it plays. And I knew it was going to take, I thought it was going to take, it took some time, but I thought it's going to be difficult to find it. But I was lucky enough to find one particular artist that he spotlighted, which opened me up to all the connections that he was using, and how we're going to start to look at art and architecture in relation to how this secret is getting moved, and how the steganography is there as a reminder for these groups, and as a subtle messaging that they are doing back and forth. And I'll get into the larger picture. I mean, that's basically what we do here in the X series, is we follow the X Steganography through these different government programs. And the main program that we saw around the secrecy aspect related to the UFO file, and that work's been going on for 70 years. But what we found in researching it is that it went much deeper, went back many, many thousands of years. And that actually these mystery schools tracked and held this very same secret, which is why tonight, we can look at Rockefeller's relationship to the UFO file and the X Steganography going straight from the 20th century. And then I can take us back to King Tut's tomb and show Osiris with the same X Steganography. Now, that's not random, actually. The links go all the way through, and we've shown them over these 20 episodes. So one of the things I want to do tonight, is just really find where the Rockefellers fit in. So we're going to start with the character of Nelson Rockefeller. A couple of quick things off the top of my head about Rockefeller. Governor of New York from 1959 to 1973. 14 years. Massive influence in New York. Incredible power broker. One of the 5 Rockefeller grandsons who really, you could say, controlled a great part of the world over the 20th century, and of course into the 21st century. And it was interesting when the patriarch of the family passed away last year. When I was talking to Secretary of HUD Catherine Austin Fitts, one of the interesting things that she reminded me about him was that, it wasn't such a great thing with this evil era was passing away, because these robber barons, these corporate raiders, and this particular group, the Rockefellers, although they did all these things to kind of create a stranglehold of power and to harvest citizens under their control, the gang that's coming up behind them, she reminded me, don't really care about their image very much, and that the one thing you could say about the Rockefellers and these other elite circles is that they tried very hard to maintain some kind of a public image, and that the people coming out of the technology sector into the transhumanism and the whole kind of social media world, Silicon Valley, that they feel that they have the edge with the technology, and therefore their public image doesn't matter so much. That's a very interesting difference between these two, and we're going to get into that. Let's take a quick look at Nelson Rockefeller. He also, in addition to being the 49th governor of New York, he was the 41st vice president of the United States under President Ford. And this was from 1974 to 1977. One of the interesting things I think we can say about Rockefeller is this. He was set to be President X, the same way Henry Wallace was set to be President X, moving in from the vice presidential position. Henry Wallace got detoured. Henry Wallace was coming more from that kind of beneficent group of the mystery schools with his deep connection to theosophy. And he was supposed to be moved into the role. Instead, Harry Truman bumped him at the last minute and got in. And then FDR died. And Truman became president. In this case, it was actually quite fascinating because Nelson Rockefeller, he was set to be President X, and he was coming in from the more nefarious side of things, but he also got bumped. So President X is not an easy position to get into or to hold, as we're going to find out. Let's take a look at him. This is Rockefeller campaigning in New York, and he did win the governorship 4 times there, and he was a shoo-in for the VP under Ford. One of the interesting things I like to say in relation to Nelson Rockefeller is he was kind of the perennial presidential candidate favorite. Each time the party thought they were going to go for him. So in 1964, he was set to run against JFK, but with the assassination, it turned into Johnson, and Johnson against Goldwater, and there was a blowout because of the assassination. So Rockefeller kind of hung out there as governor, waiting for his opportunity. And again, in '68, with all the violence and with Nixon coming in and with Bobby Kennedy getting shot, he got shunted aside once again. One of the key factors and one of the reasons he had a kind of Achilles heel. Not only was he a philanderer, as it were, but he was divorced. And back then, Reagan was the first president we got that was divorced. It's hard for us to imagine now with the guys who come in and out of office, but divorce was a big deal back then. So Rockefeller, it was very tricky. And the only way that he was going to get in was through being VP and then getting elected up. So this was the plan that they had for him. Rockefeller is probably one of the more affable of the Rockefellers. You know, he didn't have that kind of squirminess in public the way that David Rockefeller did. David Rockefeller certainly had the clout behind the scenes, but it was Nelson Rockefeller who had more of that political charm going for him. And this was Rockefeller for president. That's one of the original buttons for that. And I have to say that he came very close. We were just a hair's breadth away from Rockefeller running things from the presidential side. Strangely, before I go back through his career, let's take a look at how he died here. This is 1979, and he's out of office as VP, and having lost the battle. It was Ford versus Carter, and Carter won. And there were a lot of tussles there, political tussles, but there's this thing about him dying at 70, and what it says is felled by heart attack at desk, which is quite fascinating because, in fact, he was with his mistress, Megan Marshak, at the time. And what's interesting is when he died, the Rockefellers let out a press release saying, oh, he died, and he was making out his incredible art list. When he died, he just fell over onto his art list. I thought this was a weird thing. It got me going. It just seemed out of place. And then later the police debunked it and said, no, in fact, he died with his mistress, and he was, you know, they had just finished having this intimate encounter, and he had a heart attack. So, but oddly enough, there was also an art tie-in to the mistress in that they found that he had purchased a great deal of art for her recently. So it was quite an unusual situation because all these kind of bad things, the Rockefellers couldn't keep this story down. But it was also David Rockefeller's job to try to spin this in some way. And he really had difficulty with it, and there was no way to contain the press on this once they found out that Rockefeller wasn't in his own desk. So the key point for me was in the press release, he killed over making this art list. So that got me going through Rockefeller's art. And, you know, the Rockefeller family and their background is so fascinating that we're going to get into it. And, you know, the different place that they hold, the real American power base. This is really what we're talking about with the deep state and with the wall of secrecy. It takes these very small groups with amazing power, you know, and creating these charities and the things that they did, like the Rockefeller Foundation and their medical charities. They got into a position where they controlled so much of the flow and employment of important people that you really had to know Rockefeller or be in with the Rockefellers in order to get anywhere. So they had that kind of an amazing power base. But Nelson, having been VP, having been governor and almost President X, it's particularly interesting when he dies in this unusual fashion with his mistress. And you know, as it turns out, the Rockefellers can't keep the secret down. Let's just take a quick look at his mistress here. That's Megan Marshak. And she was almost 5 decades his junior, because he was just about 70 and she was just about 21. But the circumstances were absolutely unreal, and they got her out of town within something like 3 hours because there were too many questions going on and the secret was out. But was the only secret that he was there with a mistress? What was all this stuff about his art list, and what was all this about her receiving all of this artwork before he died? Very, very strange indeed. So I spent some time with that, and I was thinking about his role. This is him with President Gerald Ford as his VP. And I thought about the things that he was aspiring to in the 1980 election. That is, he wanted to get in as the Republican candidate, and he dies just the year before of a heart attack. So I spent a lot of time looking at that list he was supposedly working on, which you can get. Parts of it are available online. I had to go to a couple of different sources, but one of the pieces of artwork that jumped out at me immediately was something called Construction in Space X. You know, it was this combination of things as I was going through some of the more kind of mundane choices in the art. A few of the names really jumped out at me. One of them was Nam Gabo. And Nam Gabo was someone who was one of these intense artists who was influenced by people like Matisse. And he was known for his abstract art, and it got more and more abstract as time went on. But he was doing things in these scientific circles in Europe, and he was getting this incredible information. And something about that as early as 1928, when Nelson Rockefeller was only 20 years old, he was already getting into this kind of fascination with this Gabo character. And Gabo turns out to be quite fascinating as we go along here. And I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalist, and we're in episode 20 of the X series. And I want you to go to darkjournalist.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and it's something that keeps you and I in touch and engaged in the series and on the issues that we're tracking, you know, because social media is so undependable. One day you're there, one day you're gone. In case they press the memory hole button on the whole show, let's make sure that we keep that contact going. So go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, and what will happen, you basically get a newsletter once a week telling you what shows are coming up. And in addition, we'll also, you know, list things in there about events and all the rest of it. So it's really good pipeline between the two of us. So let's make sure that we have that going on. And before I go any further now, I want to check in with Olivia to see how we're doing with everyone.
We're doing great. We already have fantastic questions coming in. Okay.
It's more like it. Let's take a look at some of this art. This one's great. It's just called Head. This is Nam Gabo. Pretty fascinating. Pretty fascinating, I have to say. There's a lot of different impressions there, and there are different types of abstract art people, I'm sure, who could identify the style. But the strangeness of it in combination with Construction in Space X got me really digging deep into his art collection, as we're going to do right here. And in terms of who the art was eventually donated to, that story gets quite fascinating because J.P. Morgan and, you know, people like Tesla show up in relation to how this stuff got moved around. There's all kinds of very unusual connections there. But one of the things I think which is going to be most valuable is just to show you in kind of rapid succession some of this artwork. And then we're going to get into why it's so unusual that his art is communicating the X Steganography, this fascination with space, and some of the deeper technologies that I think the Rockefellers are engaged with. Now, there's another artist in that list that he was absolutely fascinated with, and it's Lee Bontekoe. And Lee Bontekoe is a New York artist who did metal sculptures and other abstract art. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. This is another one. This is one of hers. Also, we're looking at very unusual, you know, it's looking, the UFO file and Apotheum are both coming to mind as I look through her artwork. That much I can tell you. The artwork itself is quite fascinating, incredible. I found myself entranced when looking at it. And I have to say, studying Nelson Rockefeller's art collection, you instantly get a sense of how much they were aware of things. And, you know, when we get to certain pieces in his collection, it's going to blow your mind, I believe, the way it blew my mind with how advanced the curve is on the discoveries that they are in this art before they come out to the public some 50, 60 years later. There's a huge technology aspect to this. Of course, the Rockefellers were so deep in energy. They were the original oil barons, and they spent so much time at the top of that pyramid. And oddly enough, in 2014, they announced that their entire portfolio was going to go green and that oil would no longer hold such an important, of course, I mean, they got into banking, they got into medical charities, they got into so many different things. But I found this announcement odd. And again, the Rockefellers always ahead of the curve. What was the energy really that they're talking about in terms of green? What is it that they know in relation to this? The deeper I went into his art collection, the more the answers started to connect. And then the artists themselves became very interesting subjects. We're going to get through all of them tonight. Let's look at some more. I do have to say that Lee Bontekoe is some of that work, some of the biggest answers in his art collection are in here. Here's another one. Let's see. This is simply called Untitled 1960. And there is this kind of eye in it. Throughout Nelson Rockefeller's art collection, there's this eye. Eye of Horus is one of the very popular pieces in his collection. Quite unusual. Well, when we went further and further and further back into Nelson Rockefeller's art history, something very fascinating came up, which is his commissioning Diego Rivera. And I found the painting itself, the way it was displayed in some of the early versions of it, was unusual. So I'm going to have you discover it the way I did. And I'm sure some of you who are really good on the art side know this picture quite well. But the picture is called Man at the Crossroads, or at least that's the name it wound up having. Its original name was Man, Controller of the Universe, which makes more sense when we get deeper into this. Let's take a look at this commissioned work from 1933, when Nelson Rockefeller was 25 years old, in his 20s, and he is commissioning this painting for Diego Rivera, who's a very famous artist, and incredible background there. This is the first look I got at it. A lot of imagery happening there. Then there were wider views of it, and it started to make a little more sense. Man at the Crossroads, Man, Controller of the Universe. Yeah, let's take a look at that. Well, we're starting to see a definite X pattern behind this character who's holding some really odd technology. When I was looking at this more and more, it's like when you're looking at that Mayan painting and the guy is, he's running the spaceship or whatever. It's definitely one of those. You can read a lot into this, but there's so much fascinating detail in it. But it's not until we get to the next full version of it that we get the picture of what we really see was going on here with this painting. Let's take a look at it for a moment. You have some unusual movements going on in it. There's so much controversy about this piece. It was eventually scrapped, and that's also quite significant. But the X behind this character of Man at the Crossroads, with the technology, with strange biology, and with different cultural references behind him. Now, in effect, this painting, Man at the Crossroads, Man, Controller of the Universe, contains all sorts of pictures, kind of the original Sgt. Pepper cover, because there are so many different characters in here, like Darwin, like Lenin, and that's Lenin, the Soviet leader, not Lenin, the Beatle. And Rockefeller himself shows up in here, as do these very unusual figures in the corner who have these kind of gas masks. We'll see how clear that is up here. Very reminiscent of almost the Denver airport style art, kind of a horror art thing. Wouldn't you think so? And so this painting and its very unusual history in Nelson Rockefeller's early involvement with it. So what happens is ostensibly, he puts this together, that is Rivera, and he's under very clear indications not to put any political figures in it. And the first one that he puts in that has to be taken out is Abraham Lincoln, which is odd enough considering Rivera's leanings. So then the whole project is scrapped and the Rockefellers destroy it. There's some very early versions of it, but Rivera's already paid for it. And it's a big scandal, as it were, over time. And Olivia, I'm going to have you read the news article from that period of time.
Okay. A notice of Rivera and Kahlo's arrival in New York appeared in the New York Times on March 21st, 1933. Regarding the purpose of their trip, it stated, quote, "The Rockefeller mural will be 63 feet long and 17 feet high. The Rivera work will depict human intelligence in control of the forces of nature." Less than 2 months later, the same paper would be printing defenses of the final product.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Wow, thank you. There's something very unusual going on with the cover story about why this project got scrapped. Because ostensibly, it's because Rivera, out of the blue, decided to pop Lenin in here after he put Abraham Lincoln in. And that's odd. And then the fact that the Rockefellers had commissioned him and said, don't put any political figures in it, it's not that kind of a thing. And then for him to do it, well, he had come to America to gain their good graces. And he had done a mural in Detroit and was so excited to do this thing in New York. So it struck me as very, very strange. And it's been depicted, this little back and forth, in movies like Frida, about Frida Kahlo. And what was that other movie, Olivia?
Cradle Will Rock.
Cradle Will Rock. They both depict this kind of push-pull between the Rockefellers. And it doesn't quite add up for me, the particular story. But anyway, ostensibly, the story is that because he put Lenin in there with a communist-style reference. Remember, this is 1933, and the communism thing isn't such a major threat yet, but it's for capitalists, there's no way. And for him to not see that working with the Rockefellers after they said, don't put political figures in there, strikes me as quite unusual, as if he had an axe to grind. The impression that I got, and that was my interpretation, is that there was something in this that Nelson Rockefeller wanted to get out. But being young as he was, he let something out in the painting and they had to destroy it. In fact, this is not the original painting. This is the reconstruction that Diego Rivera did when he went back to Mexico, because the actual original one was destroyed. So this X pattern and the very unusual art around it. The picture is called Man at the Crossroads. It is available online through, I think it's through the MoMA website, but I do highly recommend people looking at this images, because for me, something was coming out in this. And then as we get a little bit deeper into the artwork that Rockefeller had, we'll understand this, and we'll understand why this thing about his art list and his work at MoMA seems to kind of surpass the fact that he was vice president. How does this make any sense? Something about his art collection spread out over these years is the big secret to whatever Nelson Rockefeller was engaging in. I do have to say that the artwork itself, you know, as we'll see from Rockefeller Center, which he was largely in charge of, here we have Prometheus, of course, carrying fire for mankind and being punished for it later. But references like this are all over Rockefeller Center and Rockefeller Plaza in New York. This one I find particularly interesting with all the amazing hand signals, but it says, "Wisdom and knowledge shall be the stability of thy times." And of course, we're going back to this Greek image once again. This is all going to come together a little bit as we go, but let's take a little bit of a deeper look at this art collection, because it gets absolutely mind-boggling. And again, I'll remind you that you're watching Dark Journalist, and you know, we're on part 20 of the X series, and we track the X Steganography moving through these political parties, moving through the mystery schools, and moving this secret technology through these different agencies of government over a long stretch of time. And as we've been able to do this, we've been able to track in an evidentiary fashion the development of the X. And what they've been doing with it basically is using the X Steganography as an internal symbol, as a marker to be able to track how these things are playing out over long periods of time. And they're able to communicate with each other through this symbolism because only they know what it means. But we're getting a handle on it now. I've referred to the X Steganography as a kind of Rosetta Stone for understanding how the deep state is operating with these deeper technologies. But it also goes far beyond just governmental programs and the wall of secrecy around them, as we found it moving back through history. And we're going to touch on that too, because of course the Rockefellers left a great legacy and a lot of secrets in the artwork that they selected. Okay. Another from Lee Bontecu here. Again, I'm getting that real Apotheum ship idea when looking at this. And there's lots of artistic ways to interpret it, but I find these particularly interesting in the Rockefeller collection. And there's a real big payoff at the end of this. Let's keep going. By the way, and quite good. I would say the selections are quite good with it. All right, so that's the end of that round. Let's look at these. And my feeling on these really is that there's so many answers in his collection, that they were such wizards at political secrecy that it's very hard to bring out their secrets. But the things that they selected have to be on the surface, especially the art collection. And particularly, not with David so much, but with Nelson, he betrays the things, he betrays his interests very often. Actually, even getting caught with his mistress that way shows a kind of, I want to say there's an exhibitionism to Nelson Rockefeller that's not there with David Rockefeller, who's a master of secrecy. Nelson is very out there. Remember, he's an intelligence asset for the United States government as far back as 1941. So we're going to get into him and his history as well, but let's keep going with his artwork because it's going to lead us in fascinating circles. Okay. Model for Torsion. This one, again, Nam Gabo. Now, let's take a closer look at this because this has a direct tie to this kind of invisible tech that we're going to talk about. I want to see this close up. Hold on. Now, the X is quite clear in that torsion from Nam Gabo. Would you agree? I think it's quite clear. But as fascinating as the X is here, the X being associated with torsion is really what grabbed me, because as we know, torsion physics is something that's come up in the work of Joseph Farrell. It's come up in the work of Richard Hoagland. And they go through these discoveries that Russians, these different Russian scientists made in 1984 about torsion physics. And it's an experimental physics discovery that they made, but things that are associated with it, like the Bell technology, appears to have also utilized, and the Bell technology being associated with these secret Nazi projects. These things are coming together now because the torsion link with the X has always been something that I've looked for. Finding it in his artwork is an absolute mind blower, I can tell you that. By the way, it's great to have so many of you here. And I want to remind everyone that in the second part of the episode, we're going to be taking questions with you. And the best way to get the questions to Olivia is by asking them in all caps. Please keep them tonight, as we're on the 20th episode and the first of two-parter tonight and tomorrow night. Keep the questions really steady, Eddie, on the X Steganography series that we're doing here, because we're really at the heart of the mystery now. So torsion and the X now. Model for construction in space. Remember model for construction in space X? This was on the list. Here's model for construction in space. This is very interesting, and some 40 years after making the torsion artwork. It's a very unusual four-dimensional kind of ship. No question about it. Let's keep going with our friend's work. By the way, this is a torsion fountain designed at St. Thomas Hospital by Nam Gabo.
I love that. It's gorgeous.
Isn't that something?
Mm.
But he's utilizing the torsion aspects there, and this is some, when his first torsion thing is 1928, the discoveries in 1984, do the math, it's some 56 years later. So Gabo is definitely tied into something, and Rockefeller collecting it is also quite interesting. Model for monument to the astronauts. Look at this. Monument to the astronauts, and a quite unusual model. Again, this kind of 4D rendering. I have to say that there's just a couple more with Gabo, and then we'll move on. And this also quite unusual. The same type of thing. It's construction in space again. But this whole collection opening up itself to this kind of torsion field, fourth dimensional physics, a totally different ballgame. The character of Gabo was influenced by his association with Kandinsky. And Vasily Kandinsky was, he's around in this period, actually, a little bit before, maybe 1910 to 19, in there, sort of that 20, 30-year period. And Kandinsky, of course, is this quite interesting master of abstract painting. And one of the paintings that influenced Gabo so much is this fascinating painting, which the X is very clearly defined there as a subconscious factor, whatever it happens to be. In that art, these images are pouring forward. And I feel like when we're looking at Kandinsky's work, I have a very rare Kandinsky book that someone gave to me now. It's over a decade ago. And, the images themselves will transfix your consciousness. Well, it so happens that Kandinsky got on this kick of abstract imagery from being influenced by the Theosophical Society, in particular, the work on thought forms brought forward by Annie Besant. And Besant really bringing in this element of abstract, understanding of what these thought forms looked like and how human beings generate these thought forms, got Kandinsky into this whole kind of wild frenzy about abstract art. He understood what it was, and he understood what it represented. But he, again, is going into a kind of fourth dimensional hyperspace, developing these things. It's not in a normal physical space, and his work over and over again describes that. And then, the person who comes out of that work is Gabo, and Gabo does Torsion, 1928, and it lands in our friend Nelson Rockefeller's collection. Absolutely fascinating. Let's take a look before we go any further. I love this shot of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo here. And, these are the real kind of movers and shakers artistically in that period. So what we've discovered in looking at Rockefeller's art collection is this is where they've moved the X Steganography on the Rockefeller side, which is they're displaying the influence of space, the influence of torsion physics, and they're wrapping it into the X in this very unique way. I do have to say one of the most important elements of Rockefeller's life is that he is this politician, he is this person who is out there, and again, that secrecy factor leaks through in the work that he does. And whenever we get around Rockefeller and his history, it's always this artwork that comes up in his death, comes up in the mistress' apartment, and the idea that she was getting artwork. It comes up whenever there's a bio on him. It says, well, he was vice president, yes, and an incredible art collector. So this is where the emphasis lays as far as the Rockefellers are concerned. Let's take a look at what the Rockefellers were looking to do with this technology. And let me check in first, though, with Olivia before we go on.
Marie Oliver says, could you please not hold the images so close to the camera?
Well, I appreciate that, but I'm looking at on the other side of it. I'm looking at it, and it's so far it's okay. It's okie dokie.
Okay,
Thank you for
and
telling
I
me.
just wanted to say, Charlie says, this is just the nature of the way art functions. It precedes the fields of philosophy and science, so it will always look and indeed function as some sort of revelation and initiation.
Well,
great?
yeah, there's that truth to it, and I think that they understood that they were reaching things, but also subconsciously they were giving their secrets away, and which is particularly the aspect that we want to get to in this. Now, one of the key things I think is important to keep in mind with Nelson is there's a great deal of work, for example, by people like Nomi Prinz and David Talbot, who did an incredible book. I think I have it here. This one is The Devil's Chessboard, which is just an incredible book that covers so much about Dulles and the CIA, the JFK assassination, and more. And of course, Talbot's done a number of exciting things over the years in his writing. One of the things he really concentrated on, as did Nomi Prinz, who kind of educated me on the Rockefellers' relationship to the Kennedys, is really highlight this animosity that was going on while JFK was president. Now, one of the things that they point to, and I'm going to quote from it here, is the fact that Life magazine allowed the Rockefellers to basically come out and harangue the president in their editorial pages with these open letters that were coming fast and heavy. Now, one of the interesting quotes that Kennedy made in relation to this, the problems that they got into, have to do with when Kennedy was experiencing the steel companies raising prices. And it's hard for us to imagine now, or I guess not so hard, because with all the steel tariffs and all the rest of it that have been going on. But there's something very important about steel that will come into play more as we talk about invisibility, because somehow the project for invisibility also relates to steel. And the technology surrounding this making things invisible goes directly to that. And so the fact that it comes up so heavily in the administration around JFK and also in the Trump administration, I found quite interesting. Of course, just on the surface, you can see the political tensions around this, and we can read them just as surface political tensions. So during this process, it's in April '62, the chairman of U.S. Steel announced a price hike, and this is called Clash of Dynasties, this book in particular by Richard James. And it's April 1962, the chairman of U.S. Steel announced a price hike of steel to the amount of $6 per ton, which is pretty outrageous for that period. President Kennedy protested vehemently. The president met with company chairman Roger Blow at the Oval Office, and in nationally televised remarks, the president described Blow as one of, quote, now this is Kennedy, a tiny handful of steel executives whose pursuit of private power and profit exceeds their sense of public responsibility. Some time ago, said Kennedy, I asked each American to consider what he would do for his country. And when I asked the steel companies in the last 24 hours, we had their answer. So his taking on of the steel companies and making, he was actually saying, look, we have people engaged in potential war. We have all these people in situations where, in mining companies and all the rest of it. And here you are raising prices on everyone at a very kind of precarious time and raising them dramatically. So he's taking them on TV, and those steel executives are so close with the Rockefellers, and the Rockefellers, in fact, are the ones who recommended the hike. So here we see the public clash playing out. So Rockefellers, their response to all this is to hook up with their friend who's running Henry Luce Life magazine. And so now this is from All the President's Bankers, which is Nomi Prinz's book on it. And again, we're going into this. While Rockefeller gathered his thoughts Kennedy made it known to a recalcitrant Congress that he might consider loosening fiscal policy with regard to the U.S. balance of payment deficits. This is another fight that was playing out, which is the Rockefellers. Kennedy was saying, look, when you're getting all this free money and when you're creating all this money through loans and all the rest of it, you need to have 25% in gold reserves to cover whatever you're doing with your capital. And the Rockefellers wanted this free access to capital, which eventually they got through the Federal Reserve that we had that caused the big fiscal blow up in 2008. But in this period, Kennedy's saying, look, no, you're going to have 25% gold reserves for everything that you take on. So we're getting here to this kind of tension point between the Rockefellers and the Kennedys, and it's quite a crucial point. I'm going to read a little more. So in addition to weakness in domestic business and the stock markets, nations using the surplus dollars had drained America's gold reserves to a 22-year low. It was on this and related international elements upon which Rockefeller chose to focus. On July 6, 1962, the same year, and only 2 months after the steel companies had challenged JFK, Life featured the letters between Rockefeller and Kennedy and an open piece titled A Businessman's Letter to JFK. Okay, so this is David Rockefeller grandstanding on behalf of Chase Manhattan. So basically a billionaire takes on the millionaire president. So I am confident, wrote Rockefeller, that the thoughts I express here are shared widely within the financial and business community, both here and abroad. He went on to criticize Kennedy's proposed exchange controls over capital movements, which he said would destroy the effective functioning of the dollar. He had definite opinions about the White House idea of requiring, quote, and this is Kennedy's requirement, 25% gold reserve against Federal Reserve notes and deposits. He believed that suspending the requirement might be the best way to handle the problem. And he wanted to see the law repealed altogether. Now, he didn't want any control on the kind of capital that they could access through the Federal Reserve. This was the problem that caused the financial coup of 2008. So Kennedy blocking them there, they were already gearing up for this. So this was dubbed a kind of a landmark at the time. And so Kennedy's looking at this situation, and we're seeing this tension well up. Interestingly enough, this one comes from the Devil's Chessboard, and it's a quote from someone who was running things in Peru at the time. So it's during a tour of Latin America. Robert Kennedy, who was a senator from New York, found himself in a heated discussion about Rockefeller influence in Latin America, which is where so much of this goes. The main reason that I can see that the Rockefellers had problems with Kennedy, aside from their general, kind of secrecy that they had going on, was that when these little kind of revolutions were taking place in Latin America, it was throwing their oil production, oil refinery into kind of chaos, and they were protecting their assets. So when Castro takes over Cuba, he shuts down their oil refinery in Cuba, and they want a war to go back in there and take it. That's where their tension comes from. And what they start to do is they start funding CIA secret projects through Allen Dulles for this. So we're looking at the Dulles-Rockefeller connection, and that goes deep, actually. But let's go further along the line here. So during an evening at the home of a Peruvian artist that had been arranged by Richard Goodwin, an RFK aide, Bobby brashly suggested to the gathering that Peru should assert its nationhood and nationalize its oil industry. Now, you remember when Mossadegh in Iran did this, the CIA took him out in a coup. So when he said nationalize the oil industry, the group was stunned. Why, David Rockefeller has just been down there, he said, and he told us there wouldn't be any aid if anyone acted against International Petroleum, the local Standard Oil subsidiary. Okay, and of course, Standard Oil is the Rockefeller company. So basically, David Rockefeller went down there and scared them and said, if you give us any hard time, we're going to stop US aid, saying that he's powerful enough. Now remember, David Rockefeller is not even in the government. He is just Chase Manhattan businessman and, the kind of oligarch of the finance world. He doesn't have any official position. So he's going down there and saying, I can pull these strings and you'll be out of US aid. And then he goes on to say, and he told us there wouldn't be any aid if anyone acted against the company. Oh, come on, David Rockefeller isn't the government, Bobby shot back, still playing the role of the Kennedy family tough guy. We Kennedys eat Rockefellers for breakfast. I found this was very interesting and gives us some of this idea of the tension between these two families. The Kennedys were indeed more successful at the rough and tumble of politics than the Rockefellers, but as JFK had understood, that was not the full story when it came to evaluating a family's power. And, you know, they go on to say the Kennedys had risen from saloon keepers to the top of American politics, but they were overshadowed in the imperial power by the Rockefellers who'd been there. You know, they got there 100 years before. The Kennedys really, you know, only rose with the Depression in the 20s and all the things that their dad was able to pull off in the stock market. Otherwise, they were, you know, they were coming from financially not a very good disposition, let's put it that way. So this idea of the Kennedys as these millionaires who got their way and all that, they're really first generation, second generation millionaires. The Rockefellers are going back. They've got the oil, they've got the charities, they've got all these different things happening. So it's a totally different environment. Their entrenched power is something much deeper. And their entrenched power in relation to the CIA is something that JFK was getting at. And I want to take this moment to say you're watching darkjournalist.com. Somewhere I want you to go and sign up for our newsletter. The newsletter helps us stay in touch, and that's something that, you know, it's a free newsletter where we send out once a week, and you get an idea when the shows are coming, and it keeps us in touch on that level. And also, you know, it's the kind of thing where we don't know with social media companies the way that it works, and it guarantees us, it gives us a kind of an autonomous stance with each other. So we have that pipeline set up.
And make sure to confirm it.
Yes, as a matter of fact, with the way that the mail server works now, they're going to send you a confirmation letter like that, and it's just confirm it and you're all set. You won't have to think of it again. You'll just get all the fabulous newsletters in the future. Okay, well, I'm switching over here. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Celtic Dove was asking, DJ, do you know if any of this art was commissioned? It was, wasn't it?
Well, certainly Diego Rivera's art was commissioned, and that's really kind of the crux of the entire art collection. Some of it was, yes, but I can't pick out from which ones that I chose or which ones were commissioned. I do find that if there's any to really pay the most attention to, Torsion and Construction in Space X, both of those I think are quite powerful. So what happens after this little blow up in public over the steel companies and over Rockefeller trying to take the reins back and saying, look, you know, let's go in there to Cuba and get our oil refinery back. Kennedy really starts to not like the way that the Rockefellers are playing this in the public. And he calls them out. He has this meeting with Nelson Rockefeller here. Everyone's really, JFK aides have always called this a very tense meeting. And he's basically telling Nelson Rockefeller, who by then is the governor of New York and had already served 3 administrations, foreign policy for Eisenhower. They called him, you know, FDR's man in Latin America. And he had done, Kennedy's basically saying, look, you know, I don't want this, you know, kind of public fight, and you guys really are irking me at this juncture. Here, we've got another shot of that meeting, and really, I think the tension comes right off the photos, and you can read a lot from the tension in the faces. So let's keep that in mind as we go along. Something that happens during this process is that the Dulles brothers and the Rockefellers are so close. The Dulles brothers being CIA Director Allen Dulles, and his brother John Foster Dulles, who is Secretary of State. By the time Kennedy is done with the Dulles brothers, they're both out of a job. So this is a shot of them, actually. It's quite fascinating considering the power brokers that they were. And it really looks like they're on their last legs there. Once we went through the Bay of Pigs and all the rest of it. And Kennedy said to Allen Dulles, you know, if this were England, you'd have to go. But and if this were England, I'd have to go. But since it's America, you have to go. And Dulles basically was shocked. And one of the interesting things that came up in a bio of an aide by Dulles, who, by the way, handled all the intelligence coverage on the Warren Commission and basically covered up the assassination and helped coordinate it, according to a number of the really good researchers in the case. But one of the things that he said and gave away, I think, is quite fascinating. He said, in relation to the JFK assassination, talking with this aide, after he had a drink, he said, wow, it's amazing. The aide was musing about the Kennedy assassination. He said, I can't believe that we lost this kind of favored son. And Dulles' attitude was like, oh, you have no idea. He's like, that SOB Kennedy, he thought he was a god. So we got just a little hint there of the kind of jealousy and animosity that was going on with these guys. Kennedy really shutting down Allen Dulles and his many enterprises around the globe, overthrowing nations and using American imperial power. In particular, Kennedy was concerned about what the CIA was doing in Latin America, promoting all these tin horn dictators to promote American interests like United Fruit and all the rest of it. So Kennedy wanted a totally different direction. So the Rockefellers and the Dulleses are both having a hard time here. Dulles is fired. That's the Rockefellers' main man in the CIA. Foster Dulles is kind of semi-retired, and now he's on the board at the CFR because what happens is he goes into the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. So that's where Foster Dulles goes, and in return, he gets David Rockefeller a seat on the CFR. So this is power helping power out, and really the more you dig into it, you realize that the CIA under Dulles had largely become an enforcement arm for the Rockefellers, and that's very important because we have to understand what was happening really through Central and South America at the time, and the Rockefellers' vested interests there, and that's where the CIA was going in and playing muscle man. A couple of things I want to throw around here about Nelson Rockefeller is when in the 60s, he was really kind of boosting up his image because he wanted to run for president. And that's just an interesting picture of him with Nancy Sinatra. And there's an Elvis Presley is hanging out in the back of that picture. I found that just a fascinating shot for people to take a quick look at. Nelson Rockefeller had come into a situation where he really was kind of tangoing with the Kennedys, and the Kennedys and the Rockefeller stress and the animosity between them, I think, is a very key factor in everything that goes down with the assassination and with the movements that happened around the UFO file, as we're going to find that in relation to the CIA working with the Rockefellers, this aspect comes up dramatically, and very often people will say, well, the Rockefellers, how do you connect Rockefellers with the UFO thing? They're very, very connected, and I'm going to show you in about 2 minutes. This shot is Senator Kennedy running, and David Rockefeller going to meet him at Harvard, actually, and this is about maybe 4 or 5 minutes from here, the spot, actually. And that's one of the things when we were doing the HBO special for the JFK assassination, the producer kept saying, well, you actually have to walk up JFK, John F. Kennedy Street to get to work every day, and there you go. So you can just see that it's a constant reminder. And of course, we're close to the Kennedy School, so you're just kind of in the web of things here. But at this meeting, it's very interesting because Kennedy's trying to get them to support his bid for the presidency, and they're just meeting at this event at Harvard. And when David comes away from this event, he's like, God help us if that man ever becomes president, because they realize so many of their overseas adventures and working hand in glove with the CIA will be over. So we can see a large portion of the financial elites incredibly dead set against Kennedy, but the Rockefeller aspect becomes even more important as to why they were so opposed to him. Okay, a couple of quick things in relation to Rockefellers and the UFO file. This shot is our friend Nelson Rockefeller there with Henry Kissinger. And in particular, this relationship is important. What happens is in 1957, a series of books come out about Project for America, and they are these recommendations from the Rockefeller commissions And basically, the Rockefeller get the brightest minds, and they have Henry Kissinger kind of working with scientists and all the rest of it. How do we solve the racial question in the United States? How do we solve poverty? How do we solve foreign relations? You know, all these different things. And you get all these experts come together. Now, one of the things that we like to focus on the show here is about stealth archives. Stealth archives are these letters and these different documents that are there in the public domain, and yet we can't get access to them. And they are kind of constant reminders out there about a group that knows more than the general public, but is not subject to the general public's scrutiny. This is a very important thing. I want to show a couple of quick examples of it, as I always do when we do the X show. Of course, I show this. This is actually the X is the logo of the Dark Journalist show, and it's fascinating because, of course, I chose the logo long before we were doing the series. One of these letters is the LBJ X letter, which resides at the LBJ library, with a message not to be opened until 2023. The contents of that X letter, no one knows. But what I found in this pattern when we were searching it out is I found over and over again, and this is the line that says to be opened by the director of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library not earlier than 50 years from the date June 26, 1973. Take a quick look at that. You'll find these all over the place in the political process. President Eisenhower had the Project X time capsule. Richard Nixon, as we know from this show, from the testimony of Robert Merritt, who worked for him in the Houston plan, kept an X time capsule, which related to advanced technology in the UFO file. So the X is something that is sitting there. In this case, you know, we can't get access to the time capsule. The letter is not allowed for public consumption until 2023. President Eisenhower's Project X time capsule is not allowed until 2053. So, you know, these stealth archives are there. Well, in relation to Henry Kissinger, there's also a very interesting stealth archive in relation to this Project for America series that they produced in these books and articles in 1957. So one of them that has this very unusual guest list, of contributors list, that is shrouded in secrecy. And they've never let these some 400 pages out. Now, as it turns out, we were lucky because there's someone named Bill Steinman who was really doing some yeoman's work in the early 90s around the Aztec UFO case. And the Aztec UFO case is where we get the term X-Files from, because Frank Scully was this person who wrote about that case and was a well-connected writer in that period of time. A very important figure also, I would say, generally. And the FBI realized that they really needed to shut him down. So when we get into the X part, the Aztec case is right in the middle of it. Something that happens here, too, which I think is interesting, is when we look at the Aztec case, the actual description of it sounds very much like the Roswell case. But it's easier access, too, which is, I think, kind of important. Now, there is a... there are a number of cases from that period which are staggering, but the Aztec case is unusual, and Scully's reporting on it really threatened to blow the whole thing open. Now, the FBI was very curious about it, and there's a group involved in the middle of all this that I call X Protect. And X Protect is basically dedicated at all costs to keep the secret of the UFO file and the X technology associated with it from coming out. X Protect is so active in these cases, and it's so active, especially in the 50s, that what they would do is say, oh, this guy's a hoax, that guy's a hoax, whatever it is. So they trumped up all this stuff about Frank Scully. But in fact, all he was doing was taking this really hardcore eyewitness reporting about this crash in Aztec, New Mexico. So Bill Steinman hunts down all the major players in it, and he's trying to figure out something in relation to Dr. Wang, who was one of the key players involved in the redeveloping the UFO file. So as it turns out, he was able to track down Dr. Wang's widow. And Dr. Wang's widow said, oh, yeah, he participated in that program. You know, he was doing it. We used to entertain Henry Kissinger because he was here all the time in the house talking with my husband because he was in charge of the program. So Henry Kissinger, our friend here, was the one who was in charge of the UFO file for the Rockefeller Foundation, all those investigations, all the different things that came out for Project America. But the stealth archive, just like the X letters, doesn't make it to the public. Those 400 pages never see the light of day. They're locked up in the Rockefeller Foundation somewhere. Just like the LBJX letters, just like the Project X time capsule. Sensing a theme here? Well, these groups, I'll tell you, they're very concerned about their own legacy and their own place in history, as well as the control that they have over the world. So when this information comes out, as they suspect that it will, or as different times they figured this is going to happen, they want to make sure that their role in it is definitely well, represented, shall we say. The Kennedys, Eisenhower, Nixon, all of these people, all these different ones. So when we're looking at that, we have to really take into account what's happening, which is they're vouchsafing this information so that when it comes out, they will be acknowledged for all their tremendous efforts. Henry Kissinger is shepherding the UFO file. The UFO file is being worked on by Vannevar Bush at MIT and Professor John Trump, his protege. Professor John Trump, of course, when Nikola Tesla is called in, we've just done 2 episodes, and we had a third one before that, a little while before that, going all into those connections about Trump and Tesla and how Tesla was, really leaving behind these clues, and how the person that they needed to examine that information was Professor John Trump. Professor John Trump worked on the UFO file. Professor John Trump, according to Trump himself, gave him all kinds of information and shared secrets with him. And he brings him up often. As a matter of fact, in London recently, when he was meeting with the Queen, he brought him up again. So this is not some kind of loose relative. The fact that Nixon had this close relationship with Trump, which we brought out here on this program as well, and which is factual now. We have to take these things into account when we're looking at the situation now, as we kind of time travel between, say, that era of 1960 all the way up to 2018, to understand the things that President Trump has on his side in dealing with this, the amount of knowledge that he has, why we're hearing about things like the Space Force, the Space Corps, opening the Space Council, why NASA is suddenly gearing up for missions to Mars and the Moon. We're dealing with somebody who's deep on the UFO file when we deal with Trump. There's no question about it, directly through Professor Trump, because, keeping it all in the family, that's the way you get it. Okay, quick thing about Trump before we get back to this kind of hassle going on between the Kennedys and the Rockefellers. In the last episode, we brought up the possibility of invisibility as one of the main things that they're keeping out of the UFO file, and how many UFO cases come up that involve planes flying into invisible things. We brought up a few important ones. This one is particularly interesting, by Cheryl Costa, 1943, the Navy float plane and the invisible UFO. That's an important story, and we did read it here, so I won't go back over that, but I did want to point it out. Now, since we did the program, a lot of odd things are happening in relation to the X series, and usually, look, the way that I say things, I like to do our research and let it be out there and stand for itself. But every once in a while, things get picked up in the major media. And, Snopes was one of these occasions when Snopes tried to blow holes in the fact of the Nixon time capsule story, and they couldn't. But the fact that they were paying attention to it and commenting on it, I found interesting and unusual, let's say. Now we're getting more and more messages that the mainstream is tuning in more to the X series. And I'm going to show you just how this works. Last week, of course, many of you watching know that we made allusions to Trump and what he was talking about in relation to these invisible planes. And we showed this story from The Guardian about Trump's bizarre comments about invisible planes. And in fact, he's made these bizarre comments now on 4 different occasions. So I guess not so bizarre. And so the quote is, they say, well, it wins every time because the enemy cannot see it. Even if it's right next to them, it can't see it. Invisibility. And what's happening here is either Trump is letting out something on purpose in order to threaten these other countries or to threaten these deep state influences. Or something has happened where, you know, he let out a little something and they find it hard to take it back. But in any case, they get very worried. So one of the things that we showed was this, which was in the Wonder Woman series, her flying this invisible plane, which is part of the whole Wonder Woman mythos. Now, we did our show on July 20th here, and it's up there on YouTube. Anyone can watch it. It's the previous episode about the Secret Space Force and the invisible planes. Now, one of these sites that syndicates to the Huffington Post called Now This, the lead article was Trump thinks stealth planes are invisible. July 25th, 5 days later. What is that behind Trump? It's the same Wonder Woman plane, using the same knockoff, the same imagery. I just found it fascinating because here we are, you know, engaging in this invisible plane thing. Now they're bringing it up and they're saying, you know, hey, Trump is a kook, invisible planes. The planes he was referring to are the F-35, which again come from the X-35. And we set the task of everyone to kind of solve what the whole hat trick aspect meant in this. And so many of you have sent excellent explanations, I would say. Some of the ones I have to say that I like the best suggest that the whole idea was about these 3 aces. Why is the ace of spades missing in this hat trick, which is the X-35, which is where the F-35 comes from? And many of you sent fascinating explanations for that, and I really want to thank you. And, you know, I feel that we're really getting somewhere in looking at the imagery that they are using. It brings us to another level of understanding what these programs are all about. So one of my favorite ones was people were saying the X was invisibility because that's why it wasn't there. The hat trick being in quotes, of course, the hat trick involves invisibility. In I understand the sports aspect of the hat trick, 3 goals in a row, but the hat trick actually is the rabbit out of the hat, the rabbit disappearing. So it's relating to invisibility. The hat trick in quotes bothers me on the patch. The F-35 patch has these areas, and we showed them in the last episode, which bleed through directly, that they are invisible. So they have that, and the F-35 is in fact the plane that Trump is referring to over and over again. So what's going on here? I believe that Trump is doing messaging on this, and it relates to the invisible technology. And over again, we're seeing these articles trying to take the edge off of it, saying Trump's gone crazy. He thinks these planes are real, you know, that whole kind of thing. I've got a few more articles, and I do want to show them to you before we go any further on this. Another kind of interesting shot. Okay, 7 times Trump brags about planes that literally don't exist. This is from yesterday. Okay. So they're ganging up on him in this invisible plane business. He's letting something out here. And this is where I think we're seeing the X come forward in public. And that's the X-35 technology they're talking about. Anyone who watches the program, just in case you're new, the X planes come from the work of Walter Dornberger, who's the paperclip scientist that we brought over here and from Nazi Germany, and he was ahead of their rocket program. And I found out more things about Dornberger, so we're going to be learning more about him as time goes on. But of course, he was in charge of Bell Helicopter, and Bell Helicopter has all these connections with the JFK assassination. I say that because I want to reiterate this to people, which is we've presented evidence and testimony about the Kennedy assassination being the result of the UFO file, that he wanted to share the UFO file with the Russians. We have the testimony of the former Watergate lawyer who said that the top CIA super spy, Howard Hunt, told him that. So that's not some wild guess. That's the former Watergate lawyer talking to his friend, former CIA super spy, saying the reason Kennedy was assassinated was over the UFO file because he wanted to share it. The way that they put it was give away our most important national security secret. So we have to understand the Kennedy thing. Sometimes even Kennedy researchers will say, well, these wild theories out there and all the rest. But, we have solid evidentiary evidence. It's the background on it is so solid. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of things in relation to this. And this is quite fascinating, actually. There's two documents, and I've pointed these out when we've done important JFK specials. This one is the National Security Action Memorandum 271. It's NSAM 271 for NASA, the administrator of NASA, and the subject is cooperation with the USSR on outer space matters. That's right at the Kennedy Library. It's undeniable. He's saying to them 10 days before he's assassinated, you need to cooperate with the Soviets in relation to my new policy of dealing with them. That new policy is contained in a FOIA document that was received by a school teacher from the CIA. And this goes back now to 2010 when it came out, but the memo's from November 12th, 1963, and the name, it's to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The name of the memo is Classification Review of All UFO Intelligence Files Affecting National Security. And it says, as I discussed with you previously, I've initiated and have instructed James Webb in this memo to develop a program with the Soviet Union in joint space and lunar exploration. The moon missions are going to be joint missions. There's no space race, none of that junk. Kennedy sees this as in the interests of the world, these countries working together. So what he says is, we need to develop this program with the Soviet Union in joint space and lunar exploration. It would be very helpful if you would have the high threat cases, that's UFOs, high threat cases of UFOs, reviewed with the purpose of identification of bona fides as opposed to classified US CIA and USAF sources. So he's saying actual UFO sightings versus secret things that were flying around. It's important that we have a clear distinction between the knowns and unknowns in the event the Soviets try to mistake our extended cooperation as a cover for intelligence gathering for the defense and space program. Let's break it down real easy. He's saying, look, we have this new program with them. We're sharing this stuff, but you have to tell them about our UFO program, what we know about UFOs and the redevelopment that's going on in the UFO file. Because if they see one of these craft over their nuclear facilities, we want them to know what it is, and it's not one of ours. Then he says, when this data has been sorted out, I would like you to arrange a program of data sharing with NASA where unknowns are a factor. This will help NASA mission directors in their defensive responsibility. He's literally putting it on the level of saying that there's a defense posture in relation to the UFO file. There's no question about it. I'd like an interim report on this data review no later than February 1st, 1964. Those two documents with the testimony of Douglas Caddy about Howard Hunt let us know, help us understand that the UFO file is the key factor in relation to the JFK assassination. I don't think there's any question about it. But now the Trump factor getting into the invisible planes and letting that secret out in the way that the press is pounding him in relation to Russia and all the rest of it, and why didn't he have a translator? That's something we picked up on in the last episode. Well, one of the things we showed, and I'll actually show it here again because I think it's relevant, which is that when these leaders meet without a translator, or with just a translator and without any staff present, it means they can speak their mind and discuss the UFO file. This is what those meetings are for. Of course, they discuss other things, but that gives them the ability to do that. This is the meeting that they had where the press went through the roof. Well, here's Kennedy doing the same thing with just an interpreter, meeting with Khrushchev, which again, he's advised against doing. Who else did it? Well, Reagan did it with Gorbachev. So, and in that meeting, of course, as I mention often on this program, Gorbachev came out later and said, well, he was talking to Charlie Rose, actually, pre-scandal Charlie Rose, and he said, Henry Kissinger, of all people, is in the audience. And he says, Reagan came to me at Reykjavik and without any staff present. And he said, if we get into a battle with an off-world civilization, will you help us? And he was dead serious. And Gorbachev said he was kind of freaked out, but he said, yeah, of course I'll help you. So we have to understand that presidential meetings have taken place at this level on the UFO file. It's just, it's on the record. Gorbachev put it on the record. JFK put it on the record. And now I think what we're having is Trump is putting it on the record with the invisible plane thing. So now the Rockefellers and the UFO file. Let's think about this for a moment. They're discovering their torsion and all this. They have the money, the scientific resources, the medical resources to really understand this. So there is, in fact, a Rockefeller who takes it upon himself, finally, in the 1990s to say, we have to bring this out. Now, this Rockefeller, Lawrence Rockefeller, was different than Nelson and different, of course, Nelson had been dead since 1979, but he was different from David, and he was not as much of an opportunist, and he was kind of the unusual one. Michael Rockefeller, the other brother, he'd gone into the jungle, and he wanted to interact with these tribes, and he had disappeared. So here we have another kind of slightly eccentric brother who wants to do something for humanity and isn't all about the Rockefellers dominating the world the way that David is. And really, I think the more you discover it, David really is the grandson, heir apparent for John D, because he's absolutely ruthless in these matters. Here we have Lawrence Rockefeller did so much on the UFO file, but the Clintons met with him on this very issue. And the book that we have there, Hillary Clinton holding, is a book that Lawrence Rockefeller gives to her, and it's all about UFOs and the history on UFOs. This has already been sorted out. Everyone knows that was the book that she had. It's not like it's someone's question. But Lawrence Rockefeller wanted this to come out in the 90s, and there was this great push. You had people like John Mack. You had the X-Files series, interestingly enough. You had all these programs dealing with the UFO factor. The Greys were everywhere at a certain point. Lawrence Rockefeller spearheading bringing this out because he had investigated it. He wanted to put himself behind it. The Rockefellers generally wanting to stay away from this because they like the secrecy aspect, but not Lawrence Rockefeller. So he's getting into a lot of problems with his family over this. The Clintons want their hands on the UFO file. The UFO file by the 90s is just in the hands of this small group that Garrison had identified, which is associated with this X-Protect group. And he said it was in the very heart of the aerospace industry. That's Lockheed Martin is one of the core ones that he identified. Interestingly enough, when Trump gave away that info about the invisible planes, one of the leaders of Lockheed was there with him, and it was to Lockheed Martin. So we have to understand how this is playing out, which is we're in the middle of a tussle at a very deep level. And this group on the Rockefeller side, Nelson Rockefeller, very early on, they're aware of the X-Technology. They try to place it even in this mural in 1933. But through their artwork, I think we've discovered their knowledge of the X program. We know that they were in charge. They put Kissinger in charge of their UFO program in the 50s. So they're right at the heart of that redevelopment. It's on the record now because Wang's widow did it through Bill Steinman. And thank God for Bill Steinman's book, which I think is one of the UFO classics. And here's a guy who comes out, does a genius book, hardcore research. He's one of the most aggressive researchers out there. And who else does he put in the spotlight is Robert Sarbarker. He actually has a discussion with him. And Robert Sarbarker was one of the top physicists who is not someone I'll ever get tired of mentioning, because Sarbarker is someone who brings out the fact that, yes, Vannevar Bush ran the UFO file, and he also talks about the people who followed up on it. And he talks about what it is that they discovered. And he's actually shocked that they kept it classified because he thought for sure they were going to let it out at a certain point. And within about 18 months of that meeting, Tsar Barker dies after discovering this kind of gooey stuff on his, as he's getting into his car, on the door handle. So quite unusual, that whole sequence of events. Now, let's see where this leads us, interestingly enough. A couple of different things to point out. Tsar Barker, I do want to mention, and I've showed it on this program, is treated as a non-person by Wikipedia. That is, when you go to Wikipedia, it says there's no such person, there's no page, just forget about it. He doesn't exist. Now, Tsar Barker was on the level in 1950 of Robert Oppenheimer. He was one of the top physicists in the country, but he is completely shunted because he gave this interview to Bill Steinman. Bill Steinman also got Wang's widow on the record saying, no, Henry Kissinger was in charge of this. So you can see big secrets came out there with that book. And I do recommend the book. I know it's not easy to get. I'm going to get a little more from that end of the spectrum. And this is quite interesting, actually. This is the page where Wikipedia says the page Robert Tsar Barker does not exist. Tsar Barker doesn't exist. And they have a little thing in the bottom about UFO conspiracy or whatever it might be. But so basically, he's a non-person because he was one of the top scientists and he came out. Well, we're putting him back on the record here on this program. That's Robert Tsar Barker, top physicist in America in the 50s, who worked closely with Vannevar Bush and Professor John Trump on the UFO file at MIT. So why is he a non-person? Why did Kennedy get eliminated over trying to share the UFO file? And why is Trump facing incredible backlash after mentioning the Space Force and these UFO planes? That's Tsar Barker in the Saturday Evening Post, by the way. Well, there's tremendous influence by the Rockefellers over the press. That's one thing I think we need to keep in mind as we look at it here, and other forces also. But I think that what we've looked at and what we've seen is that these elite groups, when you get around the UFO file, they keep so many secrets in there, and the national defense posture, the way that they can use that national defense question saying, well, you know, it can't be revealed to the public under any circumstances. But what they are doing is there are these movements, just like we saw Hillary Clinton in the 90s and Lawrence Rockefeller. The Clintons, in their own, you know, kind of way, they've always aspired to be this power group, and they've done so many things with the Clinton Foundation and all the rest of it. And we've seen them in the middle, in the heart of all these politically shady, illegal things since, what, 1986? I mean, it's been a long time. So, and I guess if you go back with Hillary, you're going to go all the way back to Watergate. So it's quite fascinating. Now, they want their hands on the UFO file. So they have this whole thing with Podesta, where they try to come out and they expect to win the presidency in 2016, but they don't. But the plan of how they're going to release things about the UFO file to try to force it out of the hands that it's in, and also to utilize it for their own purposes, and to give the public this kind of completely watered down version of the UFO file. That plan runs through Podesta, who ran her campaign, and Tom DeLonge, who they show the close relationship. And Tom DeLonge, being the Blink-182 guy, he comes along and creates this TTSA, to the Stars Academy, and this thing, you know, is trotted out there with as many CIA spooks as you can shake a stick at, including Louis Elizondo, who was John Brennan, CIA director's main man, and John Brennan, the Drone King. So if we take this whole thing around, that was the Clinton move around the UFO file. The Trump move is on the other side, which is creating the Space Council. I want a piece of this. Now I'm going to create the Space Force. Well, it's interesting about the Space Force because one of the most ridiculous pronouncements that you can make, because of course it takes Congress to get on with creating a new armed forces, and so when he turns to General Mattis and he says, "Let's get on that, get on starting up that Space Force." It's amount of theater that we haven't seen in quite a while. It's interesting theater though, because what is Trump getting at with the invisible planes? What was it that the Rockefellers were showing in this very unusual fashion? This battle's been going on. We just showed the Rockefeller battle with the Kennedys, and we know the Dulles being close in there with the Rockefellers. Interestingly enough, one little side note I want to mention in relation to the art is that one of the people who donated, this is also fascinating to me because I don't know how they got to donate this to MoMA, which is the Museum of Modern Art, because it was obviously Rockefeller's collection. But the guy's name was Philip Lippincott Goodwin. And when I looked up his history, it was quite fascinating because, by the way, that's another one directly from, that's called Inner Eye. Okay, as if we haven't seen enough spooky art from Nelson Rockefeller's connection. And here's another one, quite fascinating, I have to say. But anyway, Philip Lippincott Goodwin was J.P. Morgan's first cousin and had worked extensively with him. In fact, he was one of the people who had spec'd out Wardenclyffe, the land for Tesla to build the tower on. Now, I've mentioned before that J.P. Morgan comes up over and over again, but one of the things I wanted to point out that I think is interesting is that J.P. Morgan never liked to be photographed. We know J.P. Morgan was the initial financier of Tesla until he found out that he was building this wireless energy tower and would put all these oil interests out of business, and we'd be in the middle of this incredible renaissance of energy. So what happens is J.P. Morgan, when he gets into these situations in the public and he comes out, if there's a photographer, he freaks out completely. There's a shot of him actually beating up a photographer in public. And I find this all very interesting because of the mystery school aspects that we bring in this program when we look at this, because I'm not suggesting that, J.P. Morgan is some alien or something. But what I'm saying is that these people are very aware of how their image can be used for kind of occult things, let's say to influence them or whatever. And the more I looked into J.P. Morgan, the more I saw mesmerists and people like that in his family background. And I just found this little bit about him fascinating. The fact that the artwork was dedicated by Philip Goodwin's son and donated to MoMA, Nelson Rockefeller's art, just got me thinking in very interesting directions when I was looking at that. So I think what we have established here is that the Rockefellers' role in the UFO file was major. Lawrence Rockefeller's attempts to get this out, working with the Clintons in the 90s, which eventually becomes this watered-down CIA TTSA thing that we get with, Louis Elizondo pretending to be some disgruntled guy when he was the right-hand man for our friend John Brennan, who was the CIA director under Obama and known as the Drone King. Those connections have to be always clear when we're looking at this. So the general rule should be when we get the CIA involved around disclosure and UFO issues and things like that, that's the big no-no. That's the warning bell sign right there. The Rockefellers and their influence on this is so well hidden, but we've seen in the artwork and in the work of Lawrence Rockefeller trying to get the UFO issue out, and in the work of Henry Kissinger spearheading their UFO research program in the 50s. I mean, this is years and years of knowing this stuff. So they're a major player on that field. Of course, when you cover the Rockefellers, you can go in so many different angles. I could have taken the angle of looking at their exploits around drugs or their exploits around energy manipulation. And I think that John Rockefeller's very unusual obsession with dominating everyone in business is quite at odds with his kind of religious upbringing and like, trying to pretend he's almost like a Sunday school teacher. And there's a kind of magic that he employs that these ministers have shown him in history. And so when I go back and I look at these people and I see their bios, I find it all very fascinating because one of the things that the ministers said to him is like, your whole point is that you can get anything from God, but you have to kind of give it back. And so this is the rationale that John D. Rockefeller used, which is that, hey, I can basically stomp everyone else into the ground, and then whatever I get out of it, I can create these charitable foundations and all the rest. But in fact, when we look at the legacy of all these things through time, what we see is that the Rockefellers have used those charitable foundations as a real stranglehold, and that they control groups like PBS so that they won't talk about things like the UFO file, or won't talk about them in a way that they don't want it to come out. So they're incredible power players, and we can see with Nelson Rockefeller, they were ready to take on and assume the presidential role. This is something that they never achieved, interestingly enough, that they badly wanted. But in their clash with another president, JFK, they certainly played a major role in getting that kind of openness in government out and shutting down the government. Because again, in relation to the UFO file, in relation to the X technology, in relation to what I call the apotheum effect and this alternative energy, the things that Tesla and people like that were working on, the Rockefellers' worst nightmare is competition. And as a matter of fact, John D. Rockefeller said competition is a sin. Before I leave this segment, I have to show you this very amusing shot of the Rockefellers that kind of sums it up. How are we doing over there, Olivia?
We're doing great. I can't wait to start asking you questions.
It's just about that time, isn't it? Yeah, so we've got an incredible crowd tonight. I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That's the kind of the easiest way to stay in touch with us. I'm going to find this photo as we go along here. Why don't you move into questions as we go?
Well, first, I wanted to say, Cutting Through the Fog grew up in Kecksburg and was there and had his own encounter with X-Protect.
Oh, yeah.
And says, the Army and unknown others terrorized our families. They hurt our barking dogs.
Wow.
So there's a lot more there, I'm sure.
Wow, that is fascinating. Kecksburg is an amazing case. It's the Kecksburg, Pennsylvania case from 1965. And that's where a UFO crashes, and there's a fast cleanup operation. But some people see this kind of acorn-shaped UFO with these hieroglyphs on it. And it is quite fascinating, actually. But what an amazing thing. What an amazing thing. No, definitely what I'd suggest is email us details on your story on that to info@darkjournalist.com. We'll definitely follow up with you.
Okay. So JJK is asking, I'm guessing the CIA's UFO files are all classified?
Well, what they did, it's quite interesting, is they came out in 2014. It's so funny that so many of the UFO people, I'm not trying to pick on George Knapp, but that he's working with Luis Elizondo, because the CIA only in 2014 came out and said, hey, remember all those UFO cases from the 50s and 60s? That was us. We were doing experimental stuff. Remember, the CIA has their own Air Force, okay? Talk about growing beyond your mandate. They said, oh, yeah, that's not alien stuff, or, don't even think about it. That was just us doing stuff. And then 3 years later, they come out with Elizondo and this other Bush guy, Mellon, and they're all saying, oh, there's some strange anomaly out there, and we have to prepare to defend against it. And that's a real interesting little op that they have going on, trying to create a congressional money pit, where they can throw this money into defending us against UFOs. That's the way they want to bring the reality out to the public. And I have to say that it's just all of that whole CIA hoax around the UFO danger aspect should be resisted completely. Okay.
Okay. Aaron Moon says, can DJ comment on the Rockefellers and Bohemian Grove? Are the Bohemian Grovers deep state? Is there any connection with Trump there?
Oh, the Bohemian Grovers are definitely, that's where all the major decisions in anything that we see politically go on, come straight out of there. And that's all Rockefeller money and the Bushes and all the rest of it. That's traditional establishment. So I would say that Trump is the outsider on this. I mean, sure, Trump's a billionaire. Sure, Trump supported everyone from the Clintons to everyone else in his career. But coming into the presidency, he's backed by the America First group of the deep state. And that's a small group in the deep state. And it has all these connections through time. One of the most fascinating things about Trump's connections is he understands about the UFO file through his uncle, John Trump, who, as we've pointed out in this program, worked with Vannevar Bush, who, according to Robert Sarbarker, the top physicist in the country at the time, Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO file. So there's no question that Trump has that knowledge from his uncle. The question is, the heart of that battle now is between these deep state forces who want to control the rollout of the UFO file and do like a TTSA type thing where it's like, ooh, you know, look at this grainy footage and we need money to protect ourselves against this alien threat. That's the CIA just playing, you know, they're getting data from people and they're playing this game with it. So yeah, Trump coming in on that is very much an outsider. And that's why things are so up in the air right now, I would say.
Mark Tarana, Olivia, have you or Daniel seen the video where Buzz Aldrin answers a question posted by an 8-year-old?
Yes. And I'm sorry, but I have seen it, and it is interesting because the little girl goes, Buzz, why didn't we go back to the moon? Which is an excellent question. Doesn't make any sense. Okay, so our last trip to the moon was 1972, and then you just stop for 40 years almost. And we're in that period now where we had the moon landings in 69. So that's going to be a 50th anniversary next year. You're going to have 50th anniversary and not discuss why the whole space program went black? Well, obviously, there were some major factors there. It involved the UFO file. There's no question about it. And to deny that is absurd. And there was a real secret space force that was in development during this period. That's the thing that Trump is getting at now. What's fascinating about that little back and forth, I think, is that Buzz Aldrin does say, well, I kind of do know why we didn't go back. But everyone's trying to say that he said we never went in the first place. And it kind of sounds like that, but he didn't. What he really is saying, I know why we didn't go back. That's what I picked up from it. There's definitely unusual things about the moon landing and all the rest of it, but the idea that we can't get out of our orbit or whatever it is, I've never fallen for that. If anything, we have this invisible factor working with the space fleet. It was an important aspect. So the invisibility is way more important than worrying about a moon landing hoax. But that conversation with Aldrin is very, very interesting. I agree.
Krill says Lawrence Rockefeller encouraged and tacitly backed Dr. Stephen Greer on bringing UFO disclosure out. Stephen Greer told Lawrence Rockefeller, you have the money and the connections to bring this out in the public. Why don't you? And Lawrence said, they'd kill me, but you're expendable, so you can. What do you think about that?
There's an awful lot of self-serving rhetoric around the Greer work. That's the thing that I'm not so taken with on that end of the spectrum. But we've seen worse. We've seen worse people just turn on Gaia TV. But yeah, it is interesting. I think it's true in this sense that Lawrence Rockefeller did, back people like John Mack, and certainly Greer was in the mix. And he got funded by other people later. And he's, he has come out and done some, I would say, almost like derivative talks at times, which touch on interesting subjects. But I think that anyone around, it seemed like Lawrence Rockefeller took a look at the field and said, well, there's John Mack, there's Linda Moulton Howe, there's Greer, like these were the people who were active and respectable in the field. And probably Stanton Friedman as well. But remember this is one thing I wanted to point out. The Rockefeller Foundation has funded research into Sumerian legends, Noah's Ark, giants. And through Lawrence Rockefeller, which is a different thing, through the UFO files. So they want control of, say, the anomalies. They don't want anything out of their reach, you know. But think about it. Why are they so interested in that end of things? They know that there's something major coming out. Now, when they said our portfolio is going green and we're not going to get into fossil fuels anymore 3 years ago, what energy is it that's coming that they're aware of? And with their knowledge of the UFO file, that's where I'm going. And I think that's where Trump's going to by saying that this whole thing about the invisible planes. I think he's trying to force an edge, saying that, you know, I'm going to brag about the technology we have and not keep it a secret. Then I can take credit for it. So I think that's quite important.
So there's a big thread tonight about JFK Jr. faking his own death, and we're going to have to address it. So what do you think about it?
It's one of those kind of abysmal things that comes up on the internet once in a while that takes somebody's tragedy and tries to put it into some sort of clickbait headline. It came out of the Q milieu, although the Q stuff, they didn't actually say it, but people around that whole thing. And it's disgraceful. I don't know what else to say about it. I mean, it's a terrible tragedy about JFK Jr. And, you know, it's bad enough. Those weird rumors that try to kind of say, well, JFK Jr. is out there, you know, influencing things. Well, not on the physical plane, he's not. And, you know, we know people who know. Alexander Bruce grew up with JFK Jr. I mean, how do you think people like that feel when stupid rumors like that fly around? So, no, we're too smart on this show to deal with that. And don't you fall for it either, because you're too smart too.
Char One Light. So do we know the relationship between Trump and Rockefeller?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's tense, and you can tell by Kissinger is kind of the bellwether there. You have to think of it like this, majorly, like the way that they look at Trump, I think, is they saw him from a particular perspective. I don't know if they understood that he knew about the UFO file through his uncle. This is research, remember, that we've announced on this show that never came out anywhere, which is that Trump's uncle, you know, the stuff about Teslas and Trump, you know, there have been rumblings about that before. But Trump's uncle, being the mentor, or being the protege, whose mentor was Vannevar Bush, who was in charge of the UFO file. I mean, that's something that we've put on the record here, and that changes the ball game, I think, quite significantly. The other thing I would say about Trump is they're probably aware of how much he shared information with Nixon. Nixon shared information with him. The fascinating thing is this. Nixon had rebutted and gone against the Rockefellers in 1974. They wanted GATT then. They got GATT in the 90s, and all of these countries and all their farming rights, and farmers were thrown off their land, and GATT went in there and ripped everything up with the International Monetary Fund. You know, Nixon stopped them from doing that in 74. So the Rockefellers saw him as a block. So when Trump and Nixon become that close association in the 1980s, as we've demonstrated on this program with letters and photographs, undeniable. Even the New York Times admits it. Then we have to understand Trump in a totally different way. So the Rockefellers probably eyed him with great suspicion, and they probably do right now as well. Okay, what else you got?
Okay.
Olivia, these are great questions.
I know you actually want to address this, even though it's slightly off topic. Line of Judea. Does Daniel think Trump would start a war with Iran to distract from potential impeachment process?
I don't think that I think the impeachment idea is some kind of weird threat. They don't have any evidence to impeach Trump, and it would, you know, they might try it, but it would be on bogus evidence. That's what they've shown. 2 years of wasted money by Robert Mueller, who's the FBI. This is a guy who was in there during 9/11. I mean, Mueller is somebody who's basically the attack dog for the Democrats. and it's quite fascinating too, I would say. I will say this in relation to Iran, because we've heard some tough talk out of Trump in relation to Iran. The minute, if the neocons get Trump's ear on Iran, and the minute that we pull anything or launch any missile in the Iran's direction, that's the end of Trump's legacy. So hopefully that never happens, because the things that he can accomplish, I think, are dramatic. But if we go down that route with John Bolton and that whole end of the spectrum, then I see that his entire legacy would be blown away, which would be very unfortunate. So let's hope that he stays out of the claws of the neocons on that, because, yeah, that certainly would be a terrible idea. But his openness towards Russia, considering Russia's close relationship with Iran, right now is telling me that he has no plans to go after Iran, but let's hope that that's the case.
JJK, so did the Rockefellers have anything to do with President Nixon's impeachment and resignation?
Yes, absolutely. Great question, but I'm going to refer right back to my comments on that, which is that, see, what happened with Nixon at a certain point, it's interesting. After he won his re-election in 1972, it was the largest margin in history. So his re-election, because he went to China and he had kind of, in some way was getting out of the Vietnam War, which he had inherited from LBJ, but he kept going also. But his incredible ratings at that point as a president in 1972 were through the roof, and he demolished George McGovern. It was like 61 to 39 or something, just incredible blow up. So when we look at that, he came in with all this confidence into 1973, and it was Watergate that did him in, which had happened in 1972 during the election. But these things happen during campaigns all the time, where people break into headquarters and steal information. We saw that with servers and all that stuff in 2016. So unfortunately, it's part of the political process. But tripping up Nixon there, Nixon, after his election on this level, was not taking orders from anybody. And this is where these presidents get into trouble. JFK was not taking it from the Rockefellers. Was not taking it from the CIA. It was going to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. Why? Because the CIA was acting as the government. The CIA is an unelected wing that Harry Truman, who created it, said needed to be reformed or abolished, because it was meant to get intel to the president to make decisions, not to go run its own affairs. And the CIA, let's face it, Allen Dulles was a Wall Street lawyer, so who are they running their affairs for? I think these are the things that we really have to look at. So in that period there, 73, 74, there's two things that Nixon is doing that's ticking off the establishment. One, he's refusing the Rockefellers on GATT and the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, which basically means, what they want is the ability to go into the third world and privatize it and buy it, sell it. And he's preventing them on that. He thinks it's too soon. He thinks it's going to kind of damn his own legacy. The second thing, as I've pointed out in this show, is he's working, and an article came out in Australia about the work he was doing in Pine Gap to bring forward a new energy source. That's why Robert Merritt's information we came forward earlier on this show was so important, I think, talking about Nixon's time capsule and how it was going to be kind of the energy solution for America, because Nixon supposedly is going to bring out this new energy source in 1975. So that's also something that the Rockefellers don't want anything to do with. So Nixon hits it hard and heavy, and they know how to use his weaknesses against him. So there's no question that the Rockefellers, by that point, had turned against him. And remember back in 1960, Nelson Rockefeller wanted to eliminate Nixon because he wanted to be in the presidency, and he almost got to be President X under Ford. Remember, both Ford and Rockefeller were both the two unelected presidents and vice presidents in history. It's just those guys. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Ford had served on the Warren Commission, and Rockefeller was a major kind of antagonist of JFK. I find it kind of an interesting shift in government. Okay.
Okay, Quasga CISO. Why wouldn't JFK get with the program?
Well, JFK, in his own kind of discussions with aides, said that he felt what was happening was America was being perceived in the third world and in Latin American countries as this thug and for propping up these tin-plated dictators. Now, it's kind of fascinating because what's going on with JFK is he has a totally different vision of the world. And he feels like we need to move away from this kind of aggressive CIA behavior around the world and, you know, move into a new paradigm of the 60s, the new frontier that he created. They're still stuck, and they won, the deep state is still stuck. They won World War II, you know, but they kept the Nazi loot. They helped the post-Nazi guys. And then they want to take it to the Russians, right? They want all that. And then they also want to rip up the rest of the world, and they don't want any competition. Remember, Rockefeller said competition is a sin. Well, if you put all those things together, it's two totally different worldviews. But Kennedy, coming in, has the public behind him. He's gaining all this traction. He's going into the whole moon program. And then he's saying, let's share the UFO file with the Soviets. He's doing a number of other things, like, you know, he's introducing the idea that the differences between capital and labor can be solved without just giving in to corporations. And he's opening up the government, and he's basically for freedom. He's not one of these people who wants to go into these other countries and overthrow them and, you know, really kind of run the world as corporate dictatorship. So he's really coming from a different place, and he thinks he has time and history behind him. So he's coming from a diametrically opposed viewpoint, I would say. And he thinks that he has, you know, what was it Dulles said about him? Kennedy thought he was a god. Well, for these guys who are used to people kind of begging for them, you have to remember that the Kennedys in that period are kind of like Bill Gates or something now in terms of the money that they had. And we hear about them being millionaires, but it's big money in those days. And they had that kind of independence, and they were charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious. So, you know, when you get Nelson Rockefeller, I think I showed that picture earlier, standing next to Kennedy. I mean, you know, the Kennedys had the charisma to change the culture, and they're fundamentally opposed to this kind of corporate raider. Like, they'd be disgusted with the whole Davos crowd and the Bilderberg crowd. You know, it's just not their thing. They're trying to move the culture forward, and that's the major difference. Groups like the Rockefellers are trying to harvest the culture.
Maybe you can help us solve a debate going on. Okay,
yes.
So is Mueller the same guy who went along with the WMDs in Iraq and allowed Hillary to profit off selling away 20% of America's uranium to Russia?
Well, I think that the WMDs in Iraq is George Tenet, who was the CIA director at the time. And there are people who think that the uranium deal was something that was cooked up, and there were so many people who let it slide. But I think the Mueller's dicey history goes back for years, and we're not going to get into all of it here, but there's no question that he has a dicey history in relation to the Bushes and the Clintons. So that's why they say both Republicans and Democrats like him. Well, deep state Republicans and deep state Democrats like him. But certainly he's the attack dog on Trump right now. And I was, Olivia and I were laughing because the cover of the New York Times today, I mean, this is the epitome of a really crappy investigation. It said, Mueller to go through Trump's tweets to find obstruction. If you're stuck at the level of looking at the guy's tweets, you got zilch. And, you know, you're spending the taxpayers' money. This guy's got nothing. Okay. He's got his lawyer who's going to talk about how Trump paid off some woman he had an affair with. Okay. You know, I guess you can dig up some dirt, but you're not moving the culture. That's for sure. But it's, you know, a lot of that stuff is to hold something over Trump's head to be like, we got you, you know, because if you move outside of the things we want you to do, if you don't have a Cold War 2.0 with Russia, for example. And remember, real liberals, Democratic liberals, would applaud meeting with Putin and solving those problems and not being bellicose. These are nuclear nations. Nuclear weapons are still very dangerous. Who are these crazy people, MSNBC? They're insane. And someone pointed out to me, and I do want to say this, that you guys are pointing out some great things. And I showed it last week, which is, but I found this fascinating, which is that MSNBC used the term steganography in one of their reports. And I was talking to Olivia about this because, we know for a fact, steganography as a term doesn't get thrown around a lot. I think the last time it was in regular parlance was like, the 17 or 1600s. So something's going on in relation to the work that we're doing. And I find it absolutely fascinating. There's that picture of Kennedy with Rockefeller and the tension between those two. And I wanted to compare the whole factor we were talking about, which is, maybe the Rockefellers could try to force their way in through Nelson Rockefeller, but Kennedy, he had the wisdom, he had the brains, and he had the charisma to pull it off for real. Okay, what else you got?
Okay, so 1111 says...
These are great questions, by the way.
What do you think of Q talking about steganography?
Well, someone just pointed that out, and do you want to point to what that was? Because someone said that Q mentioned steganography in some post about software, but I haven't actually seen that previously. So if somebody can send me the actual thing on that, that would be interesting. My feeling about Q is, first of all, I don't trust anything that we can't see. I don't think that's a good way to work. So, and then you can't rely on what it is. That's my first regular main problem with it. And then it seemed like there were multiple versions of this thing, and we've gone into it before as to what it is. Interestingly enough, Joseph Farrell, Dr. Joseph Farrell at Giza Death Star, he thinks that it's actually a foreign power trying to figure out basically how these American electorate moves, which I find very interesting, actually. But in any case, it's not something I want to get behind.
Okay, Larry Jackson, do you have a list of the UFO information that JFK was going to give to the Russians?
Well, I think we got some indication of it in the two files that I read. It is a good question, but I think the files took care of it. The two files were talking about, he wanted to give them information on high-risk cases, and he wanted to give them information on the types of UFOs that are something that we might create, that is secret aircraft, versus knowns and unknowns. So the knowns would be what we know about, the unknowns would be actual UFOs. He wanted to share the information of those high threat cases. And in the words of E. Howard Hunt to Douglas Caddy, that's where the deep state had decided that Kennedy had to go, because they consider that their most vital national security secret. Interestingly enough, it's a higher secret than the atomic bomb. So they felt, well, we now have the justification to remove him. And by the way, we'll make our friends, the Rockefellers, very happy. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions.
Okay, John K. Was Rockefeller a Mason?
It's interesting. I don't have information telling me that Rockefeller was a Mason, although if you get to the secret societies that the Rockefellers were part of over time, there may be links there that go directly into the Masons. I do find it interesting because we always run across these interesting connections with the mystery schools around the UFO file and all the rest of it. And when we were exploring John D. Rockefeller, of course, he had a very interesting meeting that made a big impression on him in 1893 with Vivekananda. Mm-hmm. And, we know from Autobiography of a Yogi that Vivekananda, now, he actually was the Yogananda's...
Actually, no.
No, he wasn't, but he was influenced by him, wasn't he?
Well, he was the first yogi to really come to the West.
Right.
So the first introduction that Western people
But Yogananda basically picked up where he left off.
He did.
And the interesting thing that I found out in relation to Yogananda is that Yogananda took a great interest in the work of the gentleman who constructed the Integratron, Van Tassel, who was into the UFO factor and claimed to have all these relationships with these UFO intelligence. I find that absolutely fascinating. As a matter of fact, several of Yogananda's disciples married Van Tassel's daughters. I found that very interesting. See, these things intersect so much because I consider that Eastern tip of Vivekananda and Yogananda to be coming out of this theosophical opening that happened, and we've done so much on that in this show, showing how theosophy is related directly to the political situation in the United States and how it's related to the UFO file and vouchsafing the UFO file and John Keeley and Nikola Tesla's information through the figure of Annie Besant, who I think we've done a better job of justifying or explaining who she was than her biographies. You know, it's interesting, the things that get left out tell us more about who these people are than the things that they're leaving in. But I think the basic setup is this: the Theosophical Society made this opening, and they were the representatives in the public of the mystery schools and other groups who came out of theosophy, like anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner's work, which we've covered on the show extensively. You know, they're right in the middle of this, telling us all about, hey, the mystery schools are interacting with the political process, and this is what's going on, and really giving us that background. The important thing, I think, for us to remember in relation to the mystery schools is that we're in the period that the mystery schools, I don't want to say promised, but predicted more, that there would be a kind of a renaissance of the work that they were doing back there around World War I. It's 100 years later, and the second round is up. So here we are, the legacy of theosophy and anthroposophy. Okay.
Okay, JJK. Did the Rockefellers have any connection to Gene Dixon, or for that matter, any spiritualism?
Well, again, interestingly enough, the Gene Dixon connection goes to our friend Nixon, who was no friend of the Rockefellers. And then we have Reagan. And Reagan kind of had a deal with the Rockefellers because they placed Bush on the ticket. So this is a tricky situation that was going on when Reagan was getting into office. But there's no doubt that the Rockefellers would always show up. But Gene Dixon in particular, and is somebody I think is very, very important. And her work, you know, giving this counsel to 5 presidents, I've called her the most powerful woman in the world at that time, because she was making these kind of life and death decisions with people like Nixon about their foreign policy in the Middle East and all the rest of it. So I do think it's absolutely important to consider her in the broader context. I haven't seen real connections of her with Rockefeller, though, now. And I do want to remind everyone to, you're watching Dark Journalist, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. That keeps our communication going back and forth. And that way we're able to send you this information just in case that at some point social media blinks out or whatever it happens to be. We'll be in a better position to kind of have this pipeline between you and I. And I know it's a fantastic crowd tonight. The questions are off the charts. We'll take a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap it up because we've got a big event tomorrow, which is part 2 of this episode, but it's dealing with the mystery school. I want to call it the Mystery School Revenge. Tomorrow night at 6 p.m. So we're going to do part 2 of this episode, part 2 of part 20. And this is the X series where we're tracking the X Steganography and the X Steganography that we've seen in these programs, where when a project goes black, it pops back up and has this X designation. And that's how we've been able to track these different things. And really, it's been exceptional because we've opened up so many things in these 20 some odd weeks that just weren't there in the public record. So we're going in a totally different direction. And I also want to appreciate all the people who supported our program. And, you know, it makes a big difference when you guys subscribe to the program. We've made it very affordable. And the support that you guys give helps us to do these deep reports. And that's something which you can do at darkjournalist.com as well. And what I can tell you is, for those of you who stepped up and done that, it makes a big difference. So thank you, and let's go deeper into the work that we're doing, because I think we have the ability with the X to get that change that we've talked about and really move the culture with the information. And you know, I've shared the information widely, and I'll tell you what I like to say, and I think it's pretty accurate, Olivia, you can tell me, but I think basically we've got about maybe 12 to 14% of the information that I've accumulated out so far in the 20 episodes that we've done. Okay.
Okay, Marco Zerpa. Did Rockefeller try to kill Reagan?
Wow. Well, I think that that's a really good question. Here's the thing. I don't like to attribute murder to anyone without having the absolute facts in my hands, but I will say this. It's Rockefeller who got Bush on the ticket. We know that for a fact. Bush is a former oil crony of the Rockefellers in Texas, worked deeply with the CIA. Dulles, CIA, Rockefeller, Bush. Bush dynasty gives us G.W. Bush, and gives us the horrible COG, continuity of government, a continuity of government people, Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. But where did they come from? Well, let's take a look. They came from the Ford administration. That's a young Dick Cheney. And that's Donald Rumsfeld as the youngest defense secretary at the time. Well, he'd come back and be an older defense secretary during what? 9/11. And remember Donald Rumsfeld carrying a stretcher of somebody out of the Pentagon building? Well, you know, there are rules against the Secretary of Defense doing that, actually, interestingly enough. Secretary of Defense, when the country is under attack, it's not even supposed to be publicly visible. So getting a photo op on the exploding Pentagon lawn, you can kind of get an idea of where these people are going. That's a very dark hole that those guys come from, and they came right out of this period that we're talking about, because during this period, let's remember that our friend Nelson Rockefeller was the VP, and he was, you know, working out with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. So these people and what they're up to, I mean, of course, Kissinger is still around, and Kissinger is a very interesting, the kind of knowledge that Kissinger possesses, I think, is quite fascinating at this point. And but I think what really rocked the house for Kissinger's world was when Gorbachev stood up at that meeting that I've cited. And there's a video of it online, which you can still find, where Gorbachev basically comes out and says, yeah, I talked about the UFO file with President Reagan. Mm-hmm. And they just show this close-up of Kissinger, and it looks like his brains are going to explode. I mean, it's and that room is just, everyone is just dropping there. You know, they're in the press club in New York, and I mean, they're dying on the vine right there. What's fascinating for me is that Charlie Rose, being the Bilderberg insider that he was, you know, he starts laughing. This is his only way to handle it, because he's like, you know, and he does this kind of weird psychotic laughter. I'm afraid to do it myself, because someone will stop, you know, they'll record me doing it, and they'll be like, this is what dark journalist is, this crazy laughter. But the crazy laugh was just something like, ha, 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 you know, and I was like, wow, Charlie Rose is having a fit because Gorbachev is coming out. Was that a good crazy
That's
laugh?
Pretty good.
I expected a larger response than that. That's okay. I guess
well,
it wasn't
was
so crazy.
A very disturbing video. I remember it vividly.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. It was so tense.
It is. It is, absolutely. So there are those little cracks in the wall of secrecy. Every once in a while, one of the bricks comes out, and we get that little glint of light, you know. And when I've talked with Catherine Fitz about this, she described it as being on a battlefield, and once in a while, it's a totally dark battlefield, but a bomb goes off, and for a second, it's like daylight. You can see everything, and it goes dark again. Okay, we'll take two more questions, and then we're out of here.
All right. So we have covered this before, but I want you to be able to direct Mark Tirana to the correct video. So he's asking, could the botched Watergate break-in have been an op to bring down Nixon by the deep state? So
yeah, you want to watch, well, in terms of the video watch JFK killed over the alien presence. That's the Dark Journalist video. It's with Douglas Caddy, and I highly recommend that. But yes is the answer. This was set up far in advance to get them caught and hopefully unravel the administration over that. But the people involved in it, like E. Howard Hunt, for example, they were also walking into the trap, which I find pretty fascinating. And, you know, as we know, we've spoken to people like St. John Hunt, E. Howard Hunt's son, about all the incredible things that his dad told him in relation to the JFK assassination. So, you know, I think what we can say for sure is that in that back and forth that was going on with Hunt, that he had to testify and sort of take the heat because his wife, they killed his wife in a plane crash, Dorothy Hunt, who was also a CIA agent for years. So this is how the CIA plays. That's why when Louis Elizondo, who's John Brennan's errand boy, comes out to play in the UFO field, we want nothing to do with him. Okay, what else you got?
Okay, this is an interesting question.
By the way, somebody asked, will I interview Sarah Palin? If you can set up Sarah Palin coming on the show, I will interview her. Yes, is the answer.
Yogi5, is there any connection between Kundalini activation and the apotheum phenomenon?
Oh, well, that is quite interesting because it gets into the mystery school working versus the technological working. So you're right with the question. You're right in the heart of what we're doing in this show, which is understanding what they're talking about is an effect. So if we understand it in a psychospiritual fashion, or if you understand it just from a technological point of view, it's getting at the same thing. So bravo in the question, and I would say the answer is definitely yes.
Just have a few questions about the artwork.
Yes.
So Charlotte Cowell, did Rockefeller have any Roerich art?
You know, I'm going to look more. That extensive file that I have, by the way, supposedly this is the file he was making when he died. It has incredible art. There's more discoveries there to be had. So I guess I will let you know for sure. But I think the artists in the audience play a very special role in this episode because they understand the genres that this different types of art comes out of. And of course, Olivia is a great artist and knows so much about art. And so it's a great help for me. I have some, you know, I
your mother's a great artist.
Yes, my mom definitely. But I think it would be great, you know, I'd like to hear more from that art community that's listening here because I think we're getting something there with the Nelson Rockefeller art that's giving us the steganography and the torsion. And if you get torsion physics thrown in with the X Steganography, you're getting right into the heart of the UFO file. There's no question about it. Remember, the UFO file is not just, you know, this is an important thing. A lot of shows or a lot of different types of research, and some of it can even be very good research, but it can be limited if we look at just off-world civilization comes here with big technology. It's a much deeper story because in Atlantis, if you go back into those legends and if you go into the Casey work and if you go into Theosophy and the Steiner work on the mystery school side and Anthroposophy's version of Atlantis, they have the advanced technology also. And they have the X. Now, one thing I didn't get to bring up that I do want to bring up is that one of the things that Nelson Rockefeller did is he created this whole plaza, and part of it was based on Queen Hatshepsut's temple in Egypt. These were the instructions that he gave to the architect. Now, I'm going to show why, when we're talking about the UFO file, we're talking also about something very, very ancient. And this is where the Osiris thing comes in, because I told you Osiris was going to be in here somewhere. In that temple, and there's a few things I want to mention here about the Eye of Horus before we're done too, so just hold on the questions for a minute, but I will get back to them. Okay. This is a very interesting ceremony in that temple. And the crossing of the arms and the legs all making this X shape made me wonder if it wasn't alluding directly to that, so I went a little bit deeper. Now, we've shown on this program the ancient Egyptians used in the Book of the Dead of this X symbol as they're holders of some kind of magic. But what they are actually is holders of a secret. And this is in King Tut's tomb. I'll show you this first. This is Osiris here getting ready to guide King Tut into the afterlife. The X is clearly visible. He's the holder of the X. And we know that he's been hacked to bits and he's been reconstituted by Isis and Horus. So what is it that we're looking at when we're looking at ancient Egyptian use of this symbol, which is going to come up again when we're tracking the UFO file in modern times? There's the Eye of Horus. Now the Eye of Horus comes up in, of course, Nelson Rockefeller's art collection. Now, this is actually an artist's version, just slightly cleaned up, of that Tut with Osiris, and the X is clear. So these mystery schools and the ancient traditions of holding the X, relating the advanced technology, and it goes back to Atlantean times. Remember, it's an advanced technology. So it's not just about talking about an off-world civilization and aliens coming to visit here. It's a totally different thing. By the way, interestingly enough, I found something about the Eye of Horus, and I'll read it to you briefly here. Let me show it to you, and then I'll take a quick look at that. Well, in the 1860s, they discovered that the Eye of Horus contained the mathematical formula that we use as the fundamental basis for mathematics in our time. So the description of it was, in ancient Egypt, most fractions were written as the sum of two or more unit fractions, a fraction with 1 as the numerator, with scribes possessing tables of answers. Thus, instead of 3/4, one would write 1/2 plus 1/4. Different parts of the Eye of Horus were thought to be used by the ancient Egyptians to represent 1 divided by the first 6 powers of 2. The right side of the pupil of the eye being a half, the pupil a quarter, the eyebrow an eighth, the left side of the eye a 16th, the curved tail a 32nd, the teardrop a 64th. The Rind, R-H-I-N-D, mathematical papyrus contains table of Horus Eye fractions. And then later they're like, there were attempts to debunk this, and actually it turns out it was just similar and, you know, whatever, but the Egyptians had it. But I find that interesting when looking again at the Rockefellers picking out the Eye of Horus in their art collection. There's always a deeper meaning around their art, it seems to me, and I wasn't reading too much into it. When you get into their art collection, you're looking at torsion physics, you're looking at these space constructions, you're looking at SpaceX, and now we have the Eye of Horus. I mean, you know, it's quite remarkable. Let's face it. This is not an ordinary art collection. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions.
So that leads right into David Tormina's question.
Yes.
DJ, was this artwork an attempt to get the X technology into the public sphere?
I think of it a little bit differently, actually. I think that the artwork is for someone who understands. So it's into steganography, really. I don't feel that the artwork is trying to inform the public of anything, because it seems like this unusual attempt, which we started with, of the man at the crossroads, was a kind of an accident. That's the way I like to look at it, by a young Nelson Rockefeller. That may be what you're talking about, where he, when he was 25, working with Diego Rivera, who his mother adored, that certainly would be what you're discussing, which is getting it into the public and getting that out front for people to know and consider. And that's the part that got destroyed. Later, the things that he takes on, I think, has to do with, this is somebody who kind of lives out loud a little bit. And I think in his collection are these secrets for somebody who understands him and understands what to look for. Yes. Okay. What else you got?
Okay, so Charlie says Kandinsky conceived of abstract art as a precise science that could be a form of encoded hypernotation. Has DJ looked into the idea of art as precise, literal stealth archive? And have you had a chance to look into other collectors of Gabo, Fontecue, etc.? Could there be some kind of abstract brotherhood of collectors?
Wow.
Interesting
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. This is someone who understands art. This is absolutely fascinating. Steganography works like art. That's why the X Steganography came up in the first place when I was looking at this. It was a function of seeing something, a repeated symbol over and over again, and understanding that, you know, as we've done the difference between, I was reading a thing about how the CIA used cryptonyms and how cryptology is different from steganography, and that someone who knows can look at it and understand what it is. And it's always out there right in plain sight where you can see it. Interestingly enough, from Nelson Rockefeller's collection is Kalinowski's The Eye of Horus. But look at this. This is his version of The Eye of Horus. Quite unusual. Quite unusual. I think since Egyptian times, they've been using in art symbols that could communicate mathematically and symbolically higher truths that were known by just a small group, but also would probably be known by an individual who was operating with a higher vision, higher sight. So yes, that idea of a brotherhood in this trade or working in art is absolutely valid. And I think we're going to discover more the more we touch on the artists that we've been talking about tonight. Wow, fascinating questions. I'll remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, stay with us. We're going to take just a couple more questions and then we're done for tonight. It's been fantastic being with everyone. And I want to say that, come back with us tomorrow night because we're doing part 2. And the part 2 episode is all about the Gurdjieff Fourth Way movement. And that involves art and the Enneagram and Ouspensky's work and the Fourth Way and all the incredible things that come out of that mystery school. And this is the Mystery School Revenge, or the Mystery School Renegades, as it were. That's tomorrow night at 6 o'clock Eastern. We'll be here with that episode on Gurdjieff and the Mystery School Renegades. Okay, what you got?
Okay, Pat Kelly, do you think Putin and Trump are working together, and if so, why?
I do. I think that both of them have come to the conclusion that the deep state is hogging the power, and they want to lessen the tensions, and I think that they do want to open up aspects of the UFO file to collaborate in space, the same way that Kennedy and Khrushchev did get rid of the space war. Well, get rid of the space race. The problem is there's a small group that wants to control things on planet Earth and beyond, and they're doing great without those two guys. So they want to marginalize Putin, and I'm not saying Putin's a saint, but they definitely have been trying to take him out of the picture, which is a very dangerous thing to do by leveling sanctions on him and crowding him out and putting hostile governments in the Ukraine, and at the same time they've been trying to bamboozle Trump out. Trump got in on very unusual circumstances, let's face it, and regardless of what anyone thinks of President Trump's policies or personality, no one should support the CIA removing a duly elected president. I object to the concept, and I think it's anti-constitutional. Okay, we'll take one last question. Miss Olivia.
Okay, David Tormina, DJ, what do you think the elite's response will be once the public really starts to understand the X?
Well, I think we're already seeing little glimpses of things that are happening around the X. We're going to see more of that come into the public. But I do feel that the fact that we've revealed it and opened it up means it's a little bit unpredictable, because The idea is at a certain point, they can either try to ridicule it or, kind of bring up something, some kind of alternate movement with the same type of theme or something along that line to get people off the trail. The X, I can tell you, is so deep. There's no way that, unless they, yank all 20 episodes, but we have them all backed up anyway. There's no putting that genie back in the bottle. So the question is, you'd have to employ some kind of a technique to change the understanding of the information that we've brought forward. But let me tell you something. We've brought forward a small amount, maximum 15% of the information we have about the X so far. So it's going deep, and you're going deep with us. And I do want to say that to everyone, which is you've done such an incredible job. There's so many great people on this. And hey, it's great to see people out there like Science Churchill and so many important people, Aaron Moon, Jay Mallet, fantastic people. Erica McLaughlin, of course, and Rika we saw earlier. And these are some of the people who show up for these chats and always ask amazing questions. And I want to thank you. The great emails and the great support that you've given the show. Please go to darkjournalist.com and stay in touch with us. Next week, we have some amazing shows coming. But before I even get into those, tomorrow is the show you want to be there for, because we're going deep into Gurdjieff, the fourth way in the Enneagram.
Yes, and a lot of people have been asking us what the next step is, other than learning about the X and, just doing the intellectual study.
The next step is learning about the X.
Well, I'd say there's a lot of practical work that you can do with the Gurdjieff system.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is incredible information that's available for all of us in the work of Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, Annie Besant and Helena Blavatsky in Theosophy, and the Gurdjieff work. I mean, absolutely fascinating. These are the core groups that came forward to give us a new view and a new culture, a new society, and they're coming back around in the 21st century to give us that foundation. We will see you tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Olivia, you get the last word. What an amazing job.
I just wanted to mention that Holy Cannabis Oil saw Susie and the Banshees with David Bowie, and Susie blew Bowie away.
Well, was that the Glass Spider tour? That's a little bit, it's not fair. It's not a fair fight if it's that period. If you had Bowie, say, in the Scary Monster period, no one's going to touch that. You can't touch this. It's one of those. But yeah, wow, great people out there tonight. Fantastic crowd. Thank you so much. And that was a good one. Olivia, the only question left, of course, tonight is what are you going to move for?
Keep it simple. Pizza tequila.
Pizza tequila. I think you're going to open up your own chain called Pizza Tequila.
Pizza tequila.
It's a good idea. Olivia's Eats. We will see you tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Be here. It's the finale of part 2 of the 20th episode of the X series. And if you're wondering, there's going to be another round of 10 episodes when we're done with that. So the X investigation is going pretty deep. And with all your help, we'll get there. So we will see you tomorrow night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Olivia.
See you tomorrow.
Really great job. You did amazing. And fantastic, really kind of like, it's interesting because I do want to say this about your work too, which is the way that you work with the questions that people ask is quite an art form. So speaking of you as an artist.
Thank you.
I
do. I create a little shape with the questions that I choose to ask.
Absolutely.
I hope people sense that. Thanks
so much, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Eastern. Be there. We'll be here.
Good night.
And of course, the night has only just begun.